Hello, I'm Chrissy Seaton. Well, 2020 is in a few days will be over and we'll begin another year. And when we look back over 2020, it has certainly been a controversial and difficult year for everyone throughout the world. We've had the difficulty of dealing with the China virus or COVID-19, and that has really put the world into a degree of chaos, whereby we've had things, the nation's economies have been affected, the health and welfare of families and organisations have been affected. So, and we've seen a sadness and death throughout the world due to this virus. And every individual has been affected in one way or another. So we can't really say that we're going to look back on 2020 with fond memories. I think we would all agree that it's been a strenuous year for us all. But amid all the unrest and the sadness and the deaths and economic difficulties, and that's had far-reaching effect. That's the effect of the economic downturn has been as sad and devastating as been the physical health of people due to the virus itself. But in amongst all this turmoil, there have been extraordinary people who have risen above all the chaos going on and who have really done tremendous care, compassion has been given. They have worked tirelessly and bravely and selflessly giving to others in all areas of society. And really, those righteous and wise people need to stand tall and be very proud, because God is certainly very proud of you and pleased with your efforts. God knows who you are. He knows. And I personally thank all those caregivers, the police forces, the armies, all those care organisations that have done so much. It has really been a credit to you how you've withstood all the stress and drama. Conversely, we have seen some political unrest and certainly some controversial election results of recent times. And we've also seen blatant disregard for people's health and safety throughout this year as well. There's been people who habitually break quarantine or don't wash their hands correctly, etc. So there has been some bad behaviour. We've seen some political parties behaving badly. Some nations have been flexing their muscles across the rest of the world. And that is never a good thing to be happening, particularly when one of those nations is where the virus originated from. So this actually brings me now to the discussion of China. Now, China has attempted to influence other sovereign nations, including Australia, and that is an ongoing thing at the moment. And so I guess for most of what the remainder of my video today is about is how it's affecting Australia. And I think it's time the rest of the world hears this, because I suspect the rest of the world's experiencing some of this to some degree. But before I go any further, I just want to make a little disclaimer here. And that is that I will be 70 next year. I am retired. I am a free agent. I am not beholden to any political party, group, organisation, business, etc. So these are my words, and this is information that I've gathered of my own accord and my thoughts on things. And this is in no way meant to be disrespectful in any way to the ordinary Chinese people living in and around China or throughout the rest of the world. My discussion that will continue now is regarding the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party. And let's discuss it because up to date, by many private individuals and certainly news media, it has been the elephant in the room that nobody wants to admit is there. Well, I'm too old to care about that. I'm one of the little people that vote, and I am going to say how I feel about these things. So we can say that the leaders of the Chinese Communist Party, that is the dictatorial leaders, and that's what it is. Let's be clear about that. We're not talking about a Western-style democracy here. So these leaders have behaved very badly. If I had to describe it, I'd say they're like petulant, self-entitled, overinflated. They're a band of ruling despots. That's what they are. There's nothing, no other words that I can find to describe it at this point in time. They have infiltrated Australia in insidious ways. Starts by buying a little acre of land here and maybe a little farm there. Then they buy out a dairy corporation. Then they're buying our water, the water that rains from God's heavens down onto our earth in Australia, and it is running through channels and creeks and rivers. They're buying some of that water. Can you believe that is actually happening? Or past political leaders in Australia have allowed that to happen? And we won't go into that discussion right now. This is absolute stupidity. So we need to get back to saying that this infiltration has not only affected our lands and waterways, but they've infiltrated our universities. They've influenced the chancellors of universities. There have been staff at universities who have been dismissed or their contract not reinstated because they've differed with some of the Chinese opinions and wishes. And there's been a raft of things go on, and much of which never makes it to mainstream media. So and there are, I've got to admit, there are some greedy, disreputable little politicians in Australia in the past, and probably some still. And it's been very easy for the Chinese Communist Party and their little infiltrating spies to grease the palms of those politicians with money and get whatever it is they want, have a vote in Parliament influenced, etc. You know how it works. So, in a way, these dictatorial leaders of China have almost developed the idea that they own Australia. Well, they'd like to. And, you know, their behaviour of just recent times has been, well, if it wasn't so serious, it would be laughable, to be honest. One would have to wonder what they're thinking with. But then what we must remind ourselves of is that we think as people who are members of a democratic Western society where our vote counts, we get to say, we the little people get to vote who comes into power. Whereas the masses of the Chinese people don't have that system or that privilege that we have in the Western world. It's not to say that they're entirely happy with what goes on in their country, but they certainly, you know, if we don't like what a politician's doing, he finds out when the next election's on because he doesn't get voted in. Australians aren't afraid to step up and say what they think when it comes to national policy and pride. So, and I'm thankful for that. So, I guess what I want to reassure other Australians and perhaps other people from other nations who are watching that the Chinese Communist Party is never going to own Australia. That's not going to happen. They'd like us to think that that's going to happen. But the mind games that the Chinese play are not threats to Australians, because we're kind of a bit cunning and, how shall I say, we don't swallow salubrious words or threats very easily. You know, we always say, where's that coming from? And hopefully that, how shall I say, custom will prevail for us. So I guess what I would like to say is that we, the little people in Australia, still vote. And so we have a democratic society, which you don't have, China, and the Chinese leaders can be voted in for life, as we've seen recently. And so when that happens, those people live under different systems and rules than we do. So we are not going to be subjugated by China's bullying, and they're never is that going to prevail in Australia. It may come up in pockets here and there, and then it goes away. But the resolve of the average Australian is not going to allow the Chinese political leaders to tell us what they're going to do and how we're going to behave towards them. Because one of the things that they fail to realise is that the average Australian has a brain, and they actually use them, and we question authority in our society. Australians would walk up to the Prime Minister of Australia and would have no qualms about putting him on the spot in front of TV cameras and asking a difficult question. What are you going to do about this? But you said such and such, what have you? They'll do it all the time. In China, you would be shot for that. So you wouldn't get a chance. You're only told, the Chinese people are told what the Chinese leaders want them to know. And they're at the behest of believing that. So what China fails to realise is that we have something that they haven't got, and something they need desperately to continue to operate, and that's our iron ore. Our iron ore is the finest iron ore in the world. You can buy it in other countries, but for what the Chinese need that our iron ore for, they can't get it anywhere else. So, you know, we, the little people, get to decide whether China gets our iron ore, and certainly we get to say how much they're going to pay for it. So it is going to cost them one way or the other. And further to that, I think the Chinese people and the leaders need to understand that we actually in Australia can live quite nicely without the things that China exports to the rest of the world. We've got a robust clothing and manufacturing industry in Australia. Okay, it costs a bit more, but do you know what? Since this Chinese virus, since this COVID outbreak, you would be surprised how many people in Australia refuse to buy anything made in China. And that goes for me as well. Because we, the little people, can speak up by our actions. But as I said, we can live without most of what China exports. We've learned to manufacture our own face masks, gloves, PPE, all that. We had to out of necessity. And why would we go back to buying an inferior product from China? So I think that China needs to realise that we don't need what they have, but they certainly need what we have a lot more. And for that reason, China's political bullies, their political leaders, and we all know who they are, they need to pull their head in a bit, because to the rest of the world, they're making a fool of themselves. And if they kind of think that they're putting it over us, while they go on with muscle flexing and rhetoric and, you know, making all sorts of glib statements, our Australian leaders, so Scott Morrison at the moment as such, he's not into playing those games. So when he says something, when he says no, he means no. And that's the feeling of the rest of the Australian people. So I'd like to end up by saying to all the righteous and wise people throughout the world this year, it has been a credit to you, all the things you've done and all the difficulties that you've been able to sidestep or rise above. And I include in those righteous and wise people the general population of China, which I think don't always agree with what their leaders say or do. And there would be many righteous and wise people amongst the Chinese population. And my heart goes to you all. And I mean that sincerely. But you too are the little people like we are. We can get to vote with our feet. You in China have to do it the way you can do it in China. And I'm not one to tell you how to do that. But I think it's important that you hear our story. And what we need to stand strong against, no matter what nation or what corner of the world we live in, we need to stand strong against dictators, despicable powers that try to control a society, a culture, or the world for that matter, as China's trying very hard to do. And what we need to concentrate on is that one central core piece of information, and that is God controls the world, not China. So on that note, I will see you in my next video, and please don't forget to subscribe to my channel. And in the meantime, take care and God bless.